I want to look today at one of the most beloved figures in British history, Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale, sometimes known as the Lady of the Lamp, is the closest thing which the British have to a national heroine. She saved countless lives during the Crimean War by instituting modern nursing practices and laying the foundations for the way that hospitals are run today. That at least is one point of view. Another would be that her arrival at the hospital in Turkey triggered a surge in deaths until the mortality rate was over 50%, far higher than any other hospital in the area. In this episode we will try and untangle the legend of the Lady of the Lamp from the often grim reality. Florence Nightingale came from a wealthy background and was educated at home by her father. By the time she reached adulthood, most young women of her class at that time thought only of contracting good marriage, but that wasn't what Florence wanted at all. Her ambition was to work in hospitals. She travelled through Europe with friends of her father, visiting different hospitals, and eventually found herself in Egypt. In Egypt, she clearly heard God speaking to her, commanding her to take up nursing as a vocation. Eventually her parents were persuaded to allow this, and she spent 4 months at a training college for Protestant deaconesses in Germany. Those 4 months in 1851 were the only medical training which Florence Nightingale ever received. Unfortunately, Florence Nightingale subscribed to a very strange view of the transmission of diseases, the so-called miasma theory. Rather than diseases being spread by germs, bacteria and viruses, which is of course how we know today that they do actually spread, she believed that diseases come from bad smells and that the smell of rotting vegetation or excrement could actually make people ill. This was an unfortunate thing to believe if you hoped to run a hospital. Worse still, Florence Nightingale believed that this was a matter of natural theology. She saw nursing as a form of natural theology, a way of discovering God's laws. This led to dreadful difficulties when she actually found herself running a hospital. The Crimean War was fought between Russia on the one hand and Britain, France and Turkey on the other. It was essentially a quarrel over Afghanistan. The British feared that if Russia had access to Afghanistan, they could threaten the imperial possession of India. The war was run very badly indeed. The conditions for the soldiers, particularly those that were wounded or ill, were dreadful. Amputations were frequently carried out there, and they were without anaesthetic or antiseptic precautions. One of the patients at Scutari, the hospital to which Florence Nightingale went at that time, was called Alexander Moore, and his bed was by a window which afforded him a perfect view of the operating theatre. The amputated limbs were simply thrown out the window, where they were eaten by local pigs which were foraging in a courtyard. It was said that at Balaclava the harbour was so full of amputated limbs that ships had difficulty forcing their way through. Something had to be done. There was outrage in England about the situation. Fortunately, the Secretary of State for War was a man called Sidney Herbert, and he was a close family friend of the Nightingales, and a particular friend of Florence Nightingale's. He decided that perfect solution to the problem of the hospitals in Turkey was to send someone of his own class out there, and so he arranged for Florence Nightingale to travel to Turkey to take over the hospital at Scutari. She reorganised it, cleaned it up, and generally took it to task. She made it much better for the men to be in. Unfortunately, the death rate began to rise inexorably. 25% of the casualties there died from dysentery, which was far higher mortality rate than in the frontline military hospitals in the Crimea itself. The men in Florence Nightingale's hospital were dying not from the wounds that they had acquired on the battlefield, but from diseases which they had picked up in the hospital itself. The death rate in the hospital in Scutari was raising eyebrows in London. Something had to be done. The government under Lord Aberdeen had resigned over the conduct of the Crimean War, and the new government decided that it was time to look into the situation and deal with it. Of course, Florence Nightingale was a protégé of Herbert's, and with his departure a new man in the post, Lord Panmure, was appointed. He decided almost at once that something really needed to be done about all those thousands of soldiers dying at the hospital in Scutari. An unromantically named Sanitary Commission was sent to Scutari, and their instructions were plain. The government told them, "It is important that you are deeply impressed with the necessity of not resting content with an order, but that you see instantly by yourselves or your agents to the commencement of the work and to its superintendence day by day until it is finished." The commission went to Scutari and at once found that there were two problems. Florence Nightingale had insisted that all the men injured in the Crimea, actually on the battlefield, were sent in ships across the Black Sea and taken to her own hospital. The journey across the Black Sea was terrible and her hospital was crowded. Because she didn't understand about germs, disease flourished there. The other problem was that beneath the building were some blocked sewers. Once these were thoroughly flushed, the death rate at once began to fall from almost 50% down to 2%. This had nothing at all to do with Florence Nightingale. She had caused the high death rate by insisting that a hospital received more and more patients. It was the army and the engineers who had taken the action necessary to bring it down. By the time the Sanitary Commission went to work, the legend of Florence Nightingale had already begun to grow, and it was in nobody's interest at all to criticise her. Queen Victoria was a great fan of hers, and the newspapers in Britain idolised her. Stories of soldiers kissing her shadow as she passed at night, carrying her famous lamp, appeared in the Times. The Crimean War had been a disastrous episode, and Florence Nightingale was the only good thing to come out of it, really. The fact that she had not saved a single life didn't matter at all. The legend of the Lady of the Lamp was a powerful one. In 1857, the year after the Crimean War ended, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet who wrote Hiawatha, wrote a shorter piece which was dedicated to Florence Nightingale. This poem was called Santa Filomena, and it helped to spread the image of Florence Nightingale as the Lady with the Lamp. One verse of Longfellow's poem reads, "A lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land, a noble type of good, heroic womanhood." Within a few years, the myth was firmly established, and ever since the British have venerated this well-meaning but hopelessly ineffectual woman. She has even been given the ultimate accolade of appearing on British currency. From 1975 to 1994, Florence Nightingale appeared on the British £10 note, which as a result became known colloquially as the Nightingale. Despite all this, Nightingale is worth remembering for one thing. Ironically, nobody today even knows what she actually did, which was in fact far more important than her nursing. Florence Nightingale herself was under no illusions as to what a disaster running a hospital had been in Turkey. She was determined to find out what had gone wrong. In Britain, she consulted William Farr, an epidemiologist, regarded today as one of the earliest experts in medical statistics, and he taught her to analyse figures and to set them out in tables and charts. She was interested in finding a new way of representing figures, feeling that dry tables and columns didn't really show what she wanted to display. It didn't take her long to discover the pie chart. She didn't invent it, but she certainly popularised it, and in particular a type of pie chart known as a polar chart, or coxcomb. It shows the different magnitudes as varying radii. Sometimes it's known as the Nightingale rose, and it's a particularly useful way of showing cyclical changes, in other words, magnitude of statistics as they vary over time. For her work in this field, Florence Nightingale was in 1855 elected a member of the Statistical Society of London, which later became the Royal Statistical Society, the first woman ever to be so honoured. Once she had put the figures into this form, Florence Nightingale could see at once what had happened, and the realisation that more people had died in her hospital than had been dying at the frontline hospitals in the Crimea was such a shock that it caused a breakdown from which she never really recovered. She wanted to publicise the fact that her hospital had been a dreadful place for soldiers to be treated, but nobody wanted to see the myth damaged at this stage. She was persuaded to bury the figures amongst a more general report on the conditions in the army at that time. Florence Nightingale remained practically an invalid for the rest of her life. She lasted until the age of 90, dying only as late as 1910. The tragedy of Florence Nightingale is to be remembered for what she failed to do, rather than what she actually achieved. As a medical professional, she was useless. Her methods caused thousands of deaths. As a statistician, though, she spent decades carrying out meticulous and groundbreaking work. Her mathematical work, though, is all but forgotten today, leaving us with the ghastly and mawkish image of the famous Lady with the Lamp.